Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Thanks for checking out another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben Dubose. So as we chat on this April 19th episode, the 2023-24 season is officially over for the Rockets. Houston did go 2-1 on that final road trip to finish at 500. And let's be real, that 41-41 year is a really nice accomplishment. It's the type of round number that, as we said in recent pods, should draw attention and turn some heads around the league. Now, granted, there was not a ton that you could take out of those final games because obviously games at the end of a season can be disjointed when there aren't direct playoff implications, and you may have veteran players either sitting out or playing minimal roles, as was the case with even the Rockets holding out Fred VanVleet the last couple of games and Dylan Brooks for the finale. But after that disappointing loss in Utah on the front end of the road back-to-back, Rockets responded very well. Quality efforts against both the Trailblazers and the Clippers, and I think they ended up with the record they deserved. You had some nice showings from Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore, your two rookies playing in expanded roles. And then Jalen Green did bounce back after what was a terrible game at Utah. It was nice to see him followed up 24 hours later with a very good one in Portland. But beyond that, I really don't think there's a ton to take away from those games specifically. So, Paolo, before we turn our attention to Rafael Stone and the news of the week, is there anything that you wanted to add or highlight related to the final three games?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it in the previous pod. Finishing 500 is really good. Losing to Utah was, well, and overall, just I want to believe in Jalen being back, right? Not being back, but Jalen, taking a leap. But I can't help but say that and this is not me being down on Jalen at all, but I can't help but say that I reached the end of the year not certain that his position, if a star comes available, is the most upgradable one besides Dylan Brooks. But for Dylan, you have obviously a man and Tarian and everything like that. So it's, assuming a guard's assuming a star that becomes available is a guard, which most of them are, most of the stars in the league are guards, and is a scorer, I think it's the tough argument to make that Jalen's not the one that's the closest to losing the spot, because yes, he did have that really good stretch, right? But then he did have some games again where it looked like a little bit like same old Jalen. Not same old, but same old from this season Jalen, when he's a lot better at all of the other things, but struggles with the shot.
Just wasn't good enough. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. The way I would frame it is that the end of the season brought some doubt back into the equation. It's not that it took away what he did in March. It's not that you can't see the path forward. It's just seeing some of those games down the stretch of the year, while none of them other than Utah, and I do think it's fair to note that there was absolutely nothing to play for in that game. Other than Utah, nothing was really dreadful. So it's not like there's any reason to think that the run he had in March was a mirage, but it just brought a little bit of doubt into the equation. And in a summer where potentially some big names could be on the trade market, it's just fair to sort of keep that in the back of your mind, because it could be sort of the last impression for the Rockets, right?
Yeah, I'm not saying trade Jalen at all. I'm just saying it's.
Yeah.
I would have loved for him to close it out on a higher note than he did, because now you're stuck in a spot where you don't really know which of the stretches is real. He did play well against the Blazers, had an efficient night, very efficient night. But then again, against the Clippers, it was a really easy game to win that shouldn't have been as hard as it was. And a better Jalen performance would have sealed it earlier in the game, considering the Rockets were playing against, the Philly Clippers.
Yeah, I will say that I think the style of play at the end of an NBA season does disproportionately harm Jalen because he's so dependent on taking the pounding that comes from going to the rack. And I think, keep in mind, he also had his leg fallen on in the Portland game. I think if Jalen tries to dial it back and turn into, let's say, 75% a step back 3-point shooter, it's really tough on him because a lot of guys, well, it's not they have to become a 75% 3-point shooter. It's just that's what it turns into for Jalen because he doesn't necessarily have the size or physicality to score at all three levels. For Jalen, it's either the threes or getting to the rim. And for various reasons, I think not wanting to risk injury with not much to play for in the final couple of games and what happened with his leg, Jalen became a little bit more reluctant to drive. And when that happens, so much of his game just turns into step back threes, and that's inherently volatile. I think for Jalen, a big part of sort of increasing the floor for him is the willingness to attack the rim, fully commit with his speed, his athleticism, draw fouls. And when he doesn't want to do that, and that's what we saw on the final road trip, then all of a sudden it can be very volatile, the final numbers based on whether or not he's making threes. So that's the benefit of the doubt that I will give to him. I think some of what happened probably just had to do with a stylistic choice of how he wanted to play those final games. But yeah, I would just say, generally speaking, the close to the season, the way he performed in April following that brilliant March, it's not that it undid it by any means. I'm certainly not saying you should trade him either. It's just it brought a little bit of doubt back into the equation, which it's not crushing, it's not crippling, it's not all of a sudden you should be feeling terrible about Jalen. It's just a little more uncertainty to his situation. Anyway,
Yeah,
as far as the team, go ahead.
And you've got to mention, I mean, they were the best 11th seed of all time. So you can relish, or not really relish, but you can kind of tell yourself that, hey, listen, any other year we're making the play-in, which is kind of the goal, even though you may look at the goal is the playoffs. And if you are in the play-in, you're 2 games away from the playoffs, so anything can happen. Who's to say that they don't get there? Although it will be tough with the league needing the Lakers there, but it's. I think I've made it sound a little bit less positive than it should have been. I'm not saying I'm not on a negative at all. It's just that these games meant very little. The record, is nice, but that's what I took away from it because it's kind of unfair as well because if he had gone off, I probably wouldn't be here raving about it. But
Right.
because of the competition, so it's a no-win situation. But since he
True.
struggled a bit, it's like he struggled against these guys. But I do see the validity in what you were saying about if the game's not structured and the games aren't balls to the wall every single possession, then Jalen does turn into more of a settle for jump shots type of guy, which obviously is more
Going to be more
volatile, as you
volatile.
said.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then as far as that final record, honestly, it's quite fitting because keep in mind, they were exactly at 500, 38-38 after that April 4th loss to the Warriors. And we knew that from a playoff perspective, that was the season ender. So as I see it, it's pretty fitting that that's where they end up. It's a good season. Well, let's be honest, it's a great season. They blew past the preseason over-under number, which I believe was 31.5. And as you said, that would have been in the play-in tournament most years. It would have been a year ago. In fact, the Thunder had a worse record than the Rockets a year ago, and yet they were in the play-in. But as we've covered ad nauseum this year, the Western Conference is historically loaded at the moment. And so, as you said, the Rockets came up a few wins short. Maybe the landscape changes this summer based on how the playoffs turn out. Perhaps the early loss by Golden State is already having some implications. We'll try to talk about that at the very back of today's pod. But as far as the Rockets and the big picture, and to try and spin this towards our topic of the day, which is Rafael Stone and the extension given to not just Rafael, but also Eli Whitus, assistant GM for the Rockets, basically Tillman Fertitta, owner of the Rockets, choosing to stay the course with the current front office. It's worth noting that even in this year where the Rockets will tell you that they fell short of their goal of the postseason, quite ambitious, but it was their goal, we'll acknowledge that, there was just so much progress with that final record. After going 22-60 last year, the 19-win jump was the biggest of any NBA team all year. It was the second biggest year-on-year jump in franchise history. And the Rockets became just the 5th NBA team in the last 30 years to immediately follow a season with 60 or more losses with a non-losing season. So there's a ton to be proud of. And I think that feeds into, again, the news of the week, which is that the Rockets officially extended the contracts of Rafael and Eli as GM and assistant GM, respectively, basically number 1 and number 2 in basketball operations for the Rockets. They didn't disclose how many years, but typically each NBA executive contract is for 4 or 5 years. And as you may recall, Rafael and Eli each just completed their 4th season with the Rockets in their current roles. So do the math. They're nearing the end of their first deal. Now they got another one that's going to take them into the late 2020s. Now, as I understand it, those deals were actually agreed to a couple of months ago, but there's no requirement for teams to disclose contracts involving their executives. So the Rockets just chose to wait until after the season to break the news. And I do kind of get it, because the goal during the season is to try and keep the focus day to day and improving from one game to the next. Anything that's more year to year and development based, I think they try to table those narratives until the off season. So that's the timing component of this. As far as my reaction, and Paolo, I have a sneaking suspicion based on our previous conversations that you're in alignment, I think it's absolutely deserved. Certainly the year-on-year growth that we just talked about, it's tremendous, and that's part of the thinking. But for a GM and a front office, it's not just about 1 year. It's about phases of a larger plan. And what this year really was a referendum on phase 1 of the rebuild. We heard them talk all last offseason about transitioning to phase 2. So this season was effectively a referendum on whether that was actually the case. Well, now that we've seen the 19-win increase, I think it's pretty clear that it is. And from a management perspective, the bottom line for me, I just don't see how anyone could look at the last 3.5 years as anything but a success. And I say 3.5 years because Rafael and Eli took their current roles in October 2020, right after Daryl Morey chose to leave. Now, of course, that's not saying that every decision they've made has been the correct one. Sure, they've had misses. And this is a league where only one team out of 30 can win the title each year. And you've got 29 other GMs trying to accomplish the same exact thing that you are. So no, you're not going to win every transaction. Some of your bets are not going to work out. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's even close to perfect. But on the whole, I do think they've done a very good job at what matters the most. And to illustrate that, here's my best argument. Imagine some team other than the Rockets and consider this scenario. Let's say the team has got to hire both a new GM and a new head coach. Translated, there's no proven leadership structure or system in place. Let's say they've got a relatively new owner that hasn't yet proven that he can oversee the construction of a good team. Let's say they have 2 big-name former MVPs, now in their 30s and on the decline a little bit, especially in the case of one of those guys. And it just so happens that they're both disgruntled and they want to leave. And because they're in their 30s, on huge contracts, and at least in one case, declining, that trade value may not be all that you want or need it to be. Let's say that team is in bad position with regards to the salary cap and future draft picks. Think back to all the assets the Rockets owed to Oklahoma City from the Chris Paul Russell Westbrook trade, that terrible one in July of 2019. Let's say there's very, very minimal young talent on the entire roster. Now, flash forward 3.5 years. Let's say that franchise is where the Rockets are today, with a young core that at this point is one of the most desirable in the entire freaking league, with a head coach that virtually everyone respects in Ime Udoka, with veterans like Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks and Jeff Green that seem to fit like a glove, both in terms of basketball and culturally, with the financial flexibility to have massive cap room again in 2025 if you think you need it, thanks to the team option after year 2 of Fred's deal. And by the way, before anyone says, oh, anybody can sign veterans once they have cap space, Fred is honestly one of the most accomplished veterans we've ever seen who signed with a bad team in free agency while he's in his prime. That typically doesn't happen.
Let me just add on top of that. Anybody can sign free agents when they have cap space, just like anybody can draft the obvious pick in every single draft that Stone's had so far, right?
Yeah.
It's the same logic. It's everybody can do the right moves were all obvious, and then the wrong moves were all huge blunders. I'm sorry, I just wanted to interrupt you because it's exactly the same reasoning people are using for the draft, which is obviously ridiculous. And I'm not saying you have that
Right.
reasoning, obviously, just pointing
But it's
out how
out there.
similar it is.
Yeah. And in the case of free agency, again, no one can point to the precedent with a bad team because it typically doesn't happen. There aren't very many cases of this. So they had to sell the vision. And then as far as the young talent component, let's get to that. Because as you just said, I've seen some lazy takes along the lines of, oh, anybody can have young talent if you tank for 3 years and you're really bad. So here's my rebuttal to that. For starters, the Rockets did not get a number 1 overall pick in any year. There was no Wemby stimulus package. Secondly, of this core 6, and by the way, it's not all based on scouting reports. We've seen some great flashes of play from all of these guys on the floor. But of these core 6, literally half of them were drafted in the back half of the first round. Tari Eason, Alperen Sengun, Cam Whitmore, all the back half of the first round. So it's not like the Rockets built this core 6 just based on having a shit ton of super high picks or great lottery luck. No, they drafted and developed well. And speaking of the draft, they're set up quite well with regards to their future picks because of that bet they made against the Brooklyn Nets in the original James Harden trade, who right now have one of the worst outlooks of any team in the league. So that gives the Rockets a pipeline to add more young talent themselves, or maybe those picks get used to upgrade the team through a trade, which the Rockets are also set up well for because they signed so many guys to very trade-friendly contracts. Think Jock Landale, Jeff Green, and so on and so forth, with year-to-year optionality. Again, go back to where the Rockets were in October 2020. If another NBA team had all of those headwinds today, and you could flip the calendar forward 3.5 years and see them as comparable to the current Rockets, I think you'd be pretty damn impressed by the management job. I think nearly everybody would view that as an above average performance, and thus it's a no-brainer to keep that management team in place. Now, why am I urging everybody to view it from the perspective of another team? That's because, and I speak from my own experience, when it's your own team, it can be very easy to miss the forest for the trees. It can be very easy to get bogged down in the minutia of grading every single transaction to the point where we lose sight of what actually matters. The NBA is the ultimate quality over quantity league. We've said it so many times. Some players and some deals are way more important than others. But if you're laser focused on evaluating one team on a daily, sometimes hourly basis, it's easy to fall into the trap of judging everything by a narrative of who's allegedly winning that day or that week or that month in terms of the news cycle and how Rockets fans and NBA fans feel about it. Look at last summer with the hyperfixation on that deal involving Usman Garuba, Ty Washington, and 2 second-round picks for cap room that didn't turn out to be entirely needed. Those are such minimal assets in the grand scheme. The deals they agreed to in the same 24-hour period with Fred and Dylan were way more important. But because the Garuba and Ty deal wasn't fully understood, and a lot of people didn't agree with it, it got analyzed to death to the point where it was blown out of proportion, and the narrative became that it was a bad week, a bad month for Rafael Stone, to the point where context was lost. And that's what happens oftentimes when it's your team. In the moment, you're laser focused on grading, reacting, and overanalyzing every single thing that your team does. It's easy to lose perspective, lose context. That's why it's important to zoom out. And so for me, to help me do that, I think it's useful to try and look at things through a different lens, i.e. what I would think if it was another franchise that I wasn't emotionally attached to. Through that lens, on the stuff that really matters, I think Rafael and Eli have gotten a lot more right than they have wrong. I don't think it's even arguable. And so it makes perfect sense to me to stay the course. Now, with all that said, there's no guarantees that it continues. I think they succeeded at phase 1, but phase 2 is about not just going from the ground floor back to relevancy, but now going from relevancy to true title contention. Maybe they're not as good at this phase. And if that's the case, maybe we're having a different discussion a few years from now when these new contracts are running out. Everybody and everything is constantly being evaluated. So let's not make this out to be like Tillman Fertitta gave them lifetime contracts. What this all basically comes down to is Tillman saying, look, we're happy with the results of phase 1 of the plan, so I'm going to entrust you guys with phase 2. To me, that's perfectly reasonable. Time will tell if they're able to actually bring a championship team to Houston, but based on what we know today, I think it's clearly the right call. Paolo, what are your general views as far as the decision Tillman and the Rockets made and ultimately why they made it?
Yeah, I think important context that I haven't quite, and I don't think you'll be sure about it either. Do we know when the contracts were expiring? Was this like the last year? Because if it was 4 years, it would be this year. The current year would be the last. If it were
Yeah,
5,
we
it
don't
would be
know
until
this for
next year.
sure, but I suspect that there was an option year. That's the way the Rockets typically do a lot of their contracts. If you recall, the same happened with Mike D'Antoni that actually led to that summer of uncertainty when the Rockets simply picked up his option. But yeah, in most cases, the option year is the inflection point, and my guess is that's what this was. You don't have someone go into a lame duck. Yeah.
So this to say what? So a lot of people confuse like the organizational direction and the plan with the GM. Those are not always the same thing. The GM may have pitched a plan to Tillman that Tillman likes. That doesn't mean that because imagine if Tillman had not renewed the contract with Stone, that doesn't mean that the plan would change necessarily. Right? If the plan is suck for 3 years, have two or three middling years where you're trying to make the jump, and then have expectations of true contention for the championship, that can be the first phase can be driven by Stone. And if Tillman feels like that he didn't do a good enough job, you could get someone else to do the rest and still maintain the same path moving forward. So to me, something that was pretty telling, and listen, I was as low on Tillman as anybody else during the Harden years, but I've got to give him credit. And this is, I know we're known for being positive. We do not get any briefs from the organization telling us to say what we're saying. I would never do that. I would never say something that I don't believe in. That's gotten, not wanting to do that, that's gotten me in trouble before. But that's just how I am. Tillman giving Stone the flexibility to go all out in an offseason where his contract is expiring tells me that he's committed to the plan, which we believe is or was and still is to suck for a bit and then make that transition all at the same time and try to flip the switch, while not, being not all in, but somewhat all in while maintaining, the young core. Tillman allowing Stone to be as aggressive as he was with the Fred VanVleet deal, which is not very long term, but it's very high, percentage of the cap at the same time. And it's not that, and Tillman likely knows that these are likely not going to be popular deals at the time that they are made, because the numbers look so pompous and to the casual fan, hey, that's a lot of money for Fred VanVleet. But when you dig into the details, you see why it made sense to give him that much money. For Dillon Brooks, the exact same thing, right? Tillman gave Stone the freedom to, despite being just 1 year away from his contract expiring, still make these huge decisions. Right? They could have punted caps. And I think the Hawks are a perfect example of this. In the Anthony Davis free agency year, where everybody knew he was going to the Lakers, the Hawks got Bogdan Bogdanovic, I think Danilo Gallinari in free agency in contracts that were easy to, get. They weren't very long term, but they were easy to get out of, a couple of years after. The Knicks did this as well when they first signed Julius Randle and Bobby Portis at the time, and I don't quite remember the exact all of the players. It was a few years ago, but there's ways for you to punt the cap space a year back. Tillman was decisive, and he let Rafael Stone, dig in and make these hard decisions. So to me, that shows me that Tillman is as hands off as it's been in the recent past, which is great. Which makes me feel good, even if it weren't Stone, even if Stone hadn't stayed at the GM, makes me confident that he would hire someone that he would let, control the team, and he wouldn't be, too involved, which is typically a bad idea. Owners being involved is almost always a bad idea. That's my first takeaway. My second takeaway is that...
By the way, let me interject real quick on the subject of Tillman. There was a revealing quote in there that he gave to Jonathan Fagin of the Chronicle, It became clear the Rockets had executed our plan to draft and develop young potential cornerstones for the franchise, stabilize the team with veterans that translated to winning games, and found our coach for the present and future. We wanted to show them, as well as the public, that we're excited with the direction the Rockets were going. We said this was phase 2. There's one line in there that I want to underscore. Found our coach for the present and future. One of the silly things that I've never bought into, but I think this should absolutely close the door on, this ridiculous idea that Rafael Stone wanted Frank Vogel or someone that wasn't Ime Udoka. First off, as someone that had intel throughout the process, you can go back and listen to our Loggerline archives. I never believed that. I think there was some agenda pushing going on there. But why in the world, if that was the case, would Tillman use the hiring of Ime Udoka as a reason to extend Rafael Stone if Rafael Stone wanted to hire someone else and the only reason why Ime is here is because of Tillman? That in and of itself disproves that silly narrative. And there's a number of narratives like that that have been pushed the last couple of years. That's just one example. But that quote from Tillman, to me, that makes it crystal clear that, and I knew this already, but there was full alignment on Ime Udoka. Yes, Tillman Fertitta wanted Ime, and they clicked when they met before the hire was made official. That's true. Rafael Stone in the front office, Eli Whitus, all those guys, they wanted Ime Udoka as well. There is a lot more, I guess, togetherness between the front office and ownership than a lot of people, not just locally, but nationally as well. There has never been dysfunction. There were times, I think, especially towards the end of the Stephen Silas administration, that maybe the front office and ownership and the coaching staff weren't all in alignment. But in terms of the front office and ownership and Rafael and Tillman and Patrick and Eli and all the other people, they are aligned and they've been aligned. And I think that quote from Tillman, I just wanted to, sorry for interjecting, but just wanted to put that in there because I think to me that highlights that there is a lot more alignment at the high levels of this franchise than I think some have given it credit for over the last couple of years.
No, that's an awesome point, and especially so when you consider that historically to this point, Tillman has been someone who has very much liked to take public credit for certain moves that he finds are good moves. The Russell Westbrook trade, an example that ended up souring, but Tillman is not afraid of putting out there when he is a big part of a decision, and he takes somewhat credit or a part of the credit for it. So it's not like, for Tillman to say this, it's not. Is it window dressing?
Yeah.
Nah, is it?
It's
Yeah,
an
I think
appropriate
it is.
expression. Yeah.
Let's go. I'm improving my whatever. So it's not window dressing. He's not saying this just for show. It's actually true. Otherwise, we know he would would have no hesitation in taking credit for it.
Yeah, this was my guy. Oh, it was a collaborative decision. And my point is that there's been a lot more collaborative decisions than some would have you believe. I think there is alignment, and that's not to say that every one of those decisions is going to work out. Again, you're always going to lose some transactions because there's 29 other GMs trying to do the exact same thing. So you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. But Rafael and ownership, Rafael and his staff, there's a lot more collaboration. Like another silly thing I've seen is that, oh, Rafael Stone must not have wanted Alperen Şengün because he hasn't always been used exactly as I would use him. So that must have been Eli and draft Twitter, and Rafael had a different agenda, but he just let them win one. No, it's possible that long term he is a big believer in Şengün's talent, but in the short term, in terms of one roster decision or one, just for a portion of one season, the way a player is used, just because the short term vision isn't exactly the same as yours, doesn't mean that he has a different long term vision or that he doesn't believe in him in the long term. It's so easy, especially with GMing, for people to just extrapolate everything to extremes and say, well, if this isn't in alignment with exactly what I want right now, then this obviously means or proves that this guy just doesn't like the player, period. And it leads to these conspiracy theories. And a lot of the time it's just, a reasonable disagreement over, what's best in the very, very short term. And shoot, some of this Şengün stuff actually wasn't even Rafael's purview at all. Some of it goes back to choices made by the Stephen Silas coaching staff and to this year, Ime Udoka's coaching staff, although I think Ime's usage of Şengün was much more in alignment with the way a lot of his fans wanted him to be used. So kudos to Ime for that. And on that subject, yeah, a lot of those guys can take victory laps. But to sort of spin it full circle, it wasn't like there was ever this huge discrepancy and, well, we need to find who's responsible for X and who's responsible for Y. No, there can be reasonable short-term disagreements, but everyone can be in alignment over the longer term, what actually matters. That fit. You see where I'm going with that?
No, for sure. I think, listen, it was pretty clear, and it has been pretty clear. And to anybody who's been paying attention to the landscape of how Rocket's Twitter and all of the talking heads analysis has trended throughout time, can tell that there are certain biases and that there are certain agendas being pushed. I think it's very interesting that more than ever nowadays, there's a lot of people out there who claim they have sources, and many of them do. Truth is, nobody knew about this until, what, 3-4 days ago. So it's everybody has all of the sources, and I'm not saying that they don't, but at the same time, a front office that has been critiqued in the past for being too leaky managed to keep this somewhat huge news indoors for a couple of months.
Yeah. And by the way, on that subject, I will say that this is where proper journalism training can still have a lot of value, even in today's landscape, perhaps more so based on today's landscape, because there's so many sources and there's so many complexities and nuance to it. Yeah, I absolutely believe that these quote unquote sources are legitimate and that some of the talk out there is based on conversations with real people, but not everything you're told by real people. Well, A, it may not be true, and B, they may be leaving out part of the story. In this case, obviously the Rockets were not telling them or me or anybody that they already had an agreement with Rafael and Eli to keep them around going back to, January or February, as I understand it. And so it's one thing to have contacts, that's important, but then you can't just then assume that, well, because I'm cool with this guy or girl, that they must be telling me the 100% truth and the entirety of the story every time that I talk to them. No, they have every reason to keep some things close to the vest. And I think, proper journalism training will tell you that. And so it's important, whatever they tell you to keep, to keep it in perspective and, follow not just words, but actions as well. I'll give you another example from the last couple of years. He who shall not be named, Kevin Porter Jr. There was so much talk about the Rockets being overly invested in him. Well, look at the contract they actually gave out. Look at before everything went down with what happened in a Manhattan hotel room that led him to being basically banished from the NBA. They had already made their flagship offseason signing at point guard. And yet you heard so much talk for years about, oh, the Rockets view KPJ as the point guard of the future. This is so wrong. This is so terrible. They're so overly invested in him. Look at the actual actions. They gave a contract that gave them so many outs because they did have concerns. They brought in a replacement in his direct position from a year ago. Even the words that they said, and some of this was public in interviews, you can't take them at face value because many times the words that are said, it's just what you say at the time. Like the last couple of years when Kevin Porter Jr. was your point guard, and he's still a developing, flawed, but certainly very talented 21 and 22-year-old prospect. What do you want the GM to say? Oh, this guy's never going to be a point guard. He's never going to make it. We're just buying time. And, this guy's a head case. No, of course they're going to spin everything positive in terms of on the record, off the record conversations because they don't want the idea out there that they're throwing him under the bus. No, they want to support him. But yet you have to combine not just what's said, again, on and off the record, with the actual actions taken. And in that case, it was pretty clear that regardless of what intel was or wasn't out there, that the Rockets had a lot more concerns with KPJ than the conventional narratives about the Stone front office would lead you to believe. And so that's an example that's obviously a year or two old now, but I think it sort of ties back into the same theme, which is that it's not just about having the relationships and talking to, important people, be it in the organization, around the league, whoever it may be. Yeah, that's part of it, but you also have to be able to contextualize what these sources, what these people tell you off the record and understand, okay, what's legitimate and what's just blowing smoke, their own version of agenda pushing, because that happens all the damn time around the NBA team, around the NBA. Every team does it. And so that's just, it's a little distinction, but it is something that, when you mention the Rockets obviously did not tell this to people, even the upper echelons. I was talking about this at Rafael's Tuesday press conference, which we'll get to in a little bit, the end of season wrap up that he gave. Even the higher ups in Rockets media, top of the food chain, not going to name names, but you can guess who I'm talking about. They did not know this the last couple of months. So this was tight-lipped. And that happens sometimes around the NBA. And you have to be comfortable with knowing the limits of your relationships. And I think sometimes people that aren't as familiar with these sort of journalism source relationships aren't always as aware as they should be of the limitations and what they don't know. Because at the end of the day, what you don't know is oftentimes, and being aware of that is just as important as what you actually do know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And it's just another reminder that people need to take everybody's information with a grain of salt, because especially people
mine
who,
as
who
well. I'm
don't
not
do,
picking on anybody. Yeah.
yeah, especially people who don't do this for a living, because there's a reason, and especially in sports journalism, and I don't want to get too far into this tangent, but this happens in Europe as well, with, football. In sports journalism is by far the type of journalism that's the most plagued by this. We have entered into a culture where a rumor is taken as a fact
Yes.
really easily, right? And as a journalist, you are it's very rare that the public actually loses trust in you unless you do it over and over and over and over again, and unless you are unable to spin whatever you said before into still being somewhat right, which happens a lot as well. So in an era of no accountability, or close to no accountability, it becomes even harder for you to be able to and extrapolate from what everybody says. And the other thing that happens, and I've been, it's I think it was the 4th anniversary not long ago, or it's about to be the 4th or 5th anniversary that I'm doing, Rockets content as a passion project. I was just a fan before. Something I've learned is that what often happens is when somebody gives you information, and they do it off the record, what oftentimes happens is you feel like you're clued in, and so you don't doubt whatever that information is. It's fact from the moment you receive it, just because it isn't public, because you feel that the other person's trusting you. You don't fact check. You don't. Most of the time you can't, and you just believe it wholeheartedly, and your judgment from there on out is clouded by what may be not false information but inaccurate information. Sometimes the other person isn't even trying to give you inaccurate information. They've just been given it themselves, and it's a huge manipulation game, obviously, because public opinion right nowadays is so easily accessible and so easily manipulated.
Right. So let's circle back to. Sorry.
Yeah.
You can finish your thought.
No. I just wanted to get that off my chest and turn it into. I actually want to talk about the press conference, because I think we both have some thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to give you one last chance to talk about keeping Rafael and the decision there if you wanted to, but I think we said enough already.
Give me 30 seconds then. I'll just put a ball on it. To me, it's mostly about most analysts don't pay close enough attention to other teams and other successful teams to be able to accurately gauge how many tiny moves they have made mistakes on and how many opportunities are missed in past teams, in the Spurs teams of the past, in the Miami Heat teams of the past, in the Golden State Warriors teams of the past, in the Nuggets teams of the present. You didn't pay close enough attention to know on a day-to-day basis what the rumors were back then. And so to fixate on the small things like second-round picks, they can be important. Nobody is denying that. You don't need to affirm it every single time a player gets traded for second-round picks. That doesn't change the fact that overall, hitting on your draft picks, hitting on your free agents, hitting on your coach, having, proven improvement on the course from a season to another, as large as the Rockets had. What was it, 19 or 22 games? 19 games. Listen, those are all things that are facts that nobody can argue against. And we may not have right now, perhaps, a superstar, or I don't think anybody at this point looks like a complete superstar on our team, but we have one of the best young collections of young talent in the league. And so Rafael Stone, not just Rafael, GMs in general, can keep jobs based off one correct massive decision.
Yeah.
If you have the right young core that can carry you into keeping your job for a long time, if you hit on the right head coach, even if the team's not the best, they may carry you for a long time as a GM. If you hit free agency well enough, that may carry you long enough as a GM.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty hard to argue against the fact that Rafael Stone has hit on the coach, hit on free agency. Perhaps you can argue to what extent, but hit on free agency. You cannot argue that he has not hit on the draft, so he has hit on three. And I don't think anybody would argue that he has not hit on the head coach. So he has hit on four massive areas. Four. In any other team in the league, a GM that makes this many massive correct decisions does not have the level of or does not have as low of an approval rating within the fan base as Rafael Stone does. And that's because the fan base is not misinformed, but miseducated on the moves as they happen, and because the Rockets are not exactly 100% transparent in the way that they communicate through the media to the fans. I think they are more so with local media, but with the grand scheme of things, the national media, I think the Rockets a lot of times allow the narrative to be built against them in the exchange, or at the cost of, not at the cost, but in exchange they get perhaps a better deal. Perfect example of this is the Fred, just real quick, the perfect example of this is the Fred VanVleet deal. The Rockets were perfectly happy letting Woj say it's a 3-year deal for, what, 120, close to 120 million for Fred VanVleet. And what that will lead to is the first reaction from everybody is this is a terrible deal. And a lot of people won't stay close enough to the rumor, especially in a crowded offseason with a lot of news, to pay attention to the fact that, oh, actually, the last year's a team option, which is a massive deal. But the Rockets, smartly, they allow the rumors to be out there for 24 hours or what have it, as this massive deal that's an overpay, because that will buy them goodwill with one of the best agents in the league, which I believe it's Rick Paul, right? The Fred VanVleet's agent.
Rich Paul. Yep.
Yeah. So you bought goodwill with that agent. Perhaps that's a part of the reason why you were able to get a team option on after the second year.
Right. They think that's more important than the narrative game. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, your fan base thinks you're worse. The whole league thinks you're worse. And how do you get back on that? With results. And that's what the Rockets have done, and that's why Rafael Stone has been. So it's, stop living so much in the moment. And there's a lot of people out there in the Rockets fan base that want you to live in the moment way more because they have personal agendas against the front office, against people within the organization. Just to put a bow on it, the massive decisions are the most important. The details are important, but they're, it's very trendy to say that the key is in the details. Well, no, the key is in the details if you get the big decisions right. If they get the big decisions wrong, the details don't matter.
Bingo. Yeah. And your point about being miseducated, I think, is a fair one. The way I framed it was, think about it from the context of another team's GM. And for me, that makes me feel a lot differently about some of this stuff when I zoom out. Some people just may not have that context, period. It's the same dynamic, though. It's the perspective you get from just hyper analyzing everything and judging how you feel about the GM based on daily narrative wars on social media or talk radio or podcasts, whatever your medium may be, isn't in alignment at all with what's going to make a GM successful at a championship level at the NBA. There's just a misalignment there, and I think we both feel the same way on that. One other headwind that Rafael had that I want to address real quickly, he followed some very big shoes in Daryl Morey. Well, literally big shoes because Daryl's a huge guy, but figuratively, Daryl had a great tenure here, and so everything Rafael does gets held to a very high standard. But even Daryl had plenty of misses and some high profile. I was thinking back, of course, over 14 years, any GM is going to have tons of hits, tons of misses. what I keep going back to, because some of the decisions, like obviously the Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook trade, you can get bogged down in minutia of, how much was him versus James Harden versus Tillman Fertitta, a lot of factors. I think back to the middle of James Harden's prime in Houston, the 4-year, $80 million deal to Ryan Anderson, which factoring in inflation in NBA contracts is like 4 years, $120 million now. That ended up being terrible. Ryan wasn't even a rotation player by the end of the second year of the contract. He was a net negative when you put him out there in the 2018 Western Conference Finals on a deal that basically today is like 4 years, $120 million. He was your flagship signing in a year that you had set up forever as having all this cap room right in the prime of James Harden's career. It was a failure, and you had to offload him using 2 first-round picks. That's how negatively the deal was viewed. And some will say, well, the Rockets were coming off a 41 and 41 year. They were an 8 seed. They didn't have much juice, so they had to overpay. And I guess you can say they got one good year out of Ryan Anderson, helping them get out of 41 and 41 land back to, a division champion. I believe they went, or not division champion, but 3 seed, lost to the Spurs in 2017, the year before Chris Paul. That was when the Rockets had that Game 6 flame out, but they did go from 41 wins the last before back to mid-50s in the first year of Mike D'Antoni. And so you give Ryan some credit in that, but certainly was nowhere near the contract that he got in terms of his overall value to the Rockets over that span. It was a clear miss. And even if you want to say, well, Gerald was operating with 2 hands tied behind his back because of the preceding season, well, who's responsible for that? It's the GM. 2 years before that, the Rockets were in the 2015 Western Conference Finals. James Harden on the up and up. So many things going their way. And then they let Josh Smith leave over the ensuing offseason. They went in on Ty Lawson, which turned out to be a total bust of a move. The chemistry, which has always been something of a blind spot for Daryl, at least at times, we've seen it in Philadelphia with how the relationships just unraveled with Ben Simmons and then, of all people, James Harden. The Rockets in the preceding 2015-2016 season, when everybody around the league thought they were set up perfectly to have cap room, relationships, everything, to potentially go after Kevin Durant and pair him with James Harden, his close friend, the Rockets were so off the rails that the year after making the Western Conference Finals, they had to let Kevin McHale go, or they felt they had to, after like 10 games or whatever it was. And they went through an entire season with an interim. It was off the rails bad. And so even if you use that to excuse the Ryan Anderson signing, now credit to Gerald identifying Eric Gordon turned out to be a great signing, but as far as the flagship, Ryan Anderson was definitely a bust. Even if you want to say he was operating with, 2 hands tied behind his back, okay, well, he's the guy who tied them based on a lot of the things that happened the previous year. And that's not to say I think Gerald Morey was a bad GM. No, not at all. He was a very good GM. I love the guy. It's just even great GMs, if you hyperanalyze every single transaction, are going to have some mistakes and sometimes even some big ones. It's just that, the good ultimately outweighs the bad. And obviously Daryl made up for it by, of course, he always hit his shot as long as he had James Harden in his prime. And then a year later, he was able to add Chris Paul to the mix. And the rest is history. We know what should have been, if not for a hamstring, Scott Foster, 0 for 27, take your pick. But the reason I bring up that example is just to say that even a GM with a very high approval rating, if you really want to look at a few deals and a short time period and analyze it, you can find some bad things. It's just with Gerald Morey, we look back on those years fondly because when we look back at the entirety of 14 years and the process, we say, okay, there was clearly a lot more good than bad. With Rafael Stone, he's had basically 4 seasons, and 3 of them were an all-out rebuild, which kudos to Tillman for greenlighting in the first place. He's basically just had 1 season where he could aggressively pursue winning at the margins. So my view is that unless something is so catastrophically off the rails that you need to step in, and I don't think the current Rockets are that at all, then give the guy a chance to implement his vision and see what happens. There's a reason you hired him in the first place after Gerald left. This season was the start of that. Let's give him a few more. And that's what this extension represents. Maybe he lives up to the standard Gerald set. Maybe he doesn't. But if we're just going to take, 1 or 2 years and limited circumstances and try to make them representative, Well, look, even a guy as good as Daryl Morey, you can point to, a few transactions, a particular season or two that weren't very good. It's just he had the chance over 14 years to make a lot of deals, and ultimately the good far outweighed the bad. With Rafael, he hasn't had that chance yet. So even if there's some things that give you hesitation, that would be sort of my cautionary tale. Remember that Daryl was not perfect either. It's just we had a large enough sample to trust him. People don't trust Rafael yet, and that's fine because again, the Rockets have only had 1 year trying to build. It's just or trying to win. Excuse me, had 3 trying to rebuild and then 1 trying to win. It's fine if you don't trust him yet. I'm not asking anybody to give him the same leash they did Daryl. It's just you shouldn't conclusively feel that you can't trust him either. It's keep an open mind. That would be the way I frame my views on this. And if it doesn't work out, then again, we can have a different discussion a couple of years from now when his current deal is getting closer to its expiration. But for now, I think it's completely justifiable what the Rockets did. All right, let's transition to the aforementioned press conference because on Tuesday, the same day that news leaked that he would be staying around, Rafael also had a press conference in tandem with Ime Udoka to wrap up the recently completed season. And so I wanted to allow both of us to give at least one high level takeaway, what stood out to us about what was said. Paolo, you want to start?
Yeah, Rafael is a lot slimmer. Is he
That
not?
he is. No,
Was
he
I the
definitely
only one
is.
that noticed it?
No,
He
he
seems a
is.
lot healthier than he did, and he seems a lot more comfortable within his own skin than he did. At least that was my takeaway just listening
Yeah,
to
I
him
think he's
speak
more
the
laid
first.
back. He's comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. The other now talking about basketball, I have to go with there's two of them, but I'm guessing you're going to pick the other one, so I'm just gonna pick one of them. I think his tone on trades and having to make a move this offseason to me was pretty not relaxing, but easing. As someone who was somewhat worried that they may pull the trigger on something too soon,
Yeah, he didn't seem like he
he,
was desperate by any means.
yeah, he didn't seem desperate. He seemed like one of those, the what has been so far in the entirety of the rebuild, which is if something really good pops up, they'll do it. If not, they're not in a all-in state at this point. I'll tag onto that the fact that when he was asked about the ninth or the 10th pick in the draft, that the Rockets are likely going to have. He said the usual, if you can get a special player, you get a special player. But I like that he mentioned the rotation is pretty, compact right now. It's really hard to get a new guy to plug into the rotation. But he did mention that, and not by these words, but I got the sense that he mentioned that, doesn't mean, I think that will lead a lot of people to believe that they are not going to draft someone because they can't play them. But at the same time, I think he also led me to a different path, which was at the same time trading the pick for a vet makes that problem even harder to solve because a vet's going to need minutes right away. And if you do draft someone, you can have them in the G League for a little bit,
Right.
and if they are good enough, that's a good problem to have, which is interesting. And I know we'll have other pods to talk about this, but it makes me wonder if they are considering a push it further down the line type of trade, maybe 2 first-round picks for pick 9 from a team that has the potential to, like Brooklyn, to fall apart. Perhaps a deal with Brooklyn where you give them back their pick this year, and in exchange you get, a couple more years of control. Who knows what would be on the table as far as that goes. But those were my two main takeaways. It seemed like a lot of serenity as far as not being pressed to make a move, and hopefully this extension makes it so the pressure is even less. The contract extension, obviously, and that the top 10 pick, the fact that the rotation is so dense may lead it, to may make it so trading the pick for vet is unlikely, but also drafting a guy may be unlikely as well, and it opens a possibility for what I think at this point would probably be the best, depending on what's available, the best move forward, which is trying to delay it and acquire draft capital in the future.
I actually had a very similar takeaway, but I want to spin it more towards free agency than the draft. I think you covered the draft fairly well and what some of the options are there. The quote that resonated with me was, we'll look at things, but again, I don't view our roster as we're missing X. We need to go find it. It's not like we have a gaping hole. And that to me strikes at the heart of the 2024 Rockets offseason, which, as I've said before, is about quality over quantity. If an all NBA type player and the right, age range that you think is a fit comes available, you can't not look at it, because as good as we feel about the core six, none of these guys has performed at even an all-star level, let alone an all NBA level on a consistent basis just yet. So in theory, if the right guy comes along that was open to coming to Houston, that isn't 39 or 40 years old, is on the market, and you can get some certainty, of course you would have to consider it. I just don't know who that would be. And outside of that, though, I think it's much more about trying to maximize what you can do from within and the development of these young guys than whatever type of player you could realistically bring in for, say, the mid-level exception, or combining these expiring or last year's salaries. Some guys that literally expire this summer, you could trade Jock Landale, for example, and somebody doesn't pick up his option, although I think at this point his option will definitely get picked up. That contract's very friendly if he shows any value at all, which he did down the stretch of this season. So I think relative to what the Rockets would have available to them with the tools at their disposal as an above the cap team, and without any clear guy that they should want to trade of high value, that I think the majority of the focus from a minute standpoint should be on maximizing opportunities internally. You want to get more minutes for both Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore. You want to slide Tari Eason not just to the role he was in this year, but if he's fully healthy, and I think he will be, one of the takeaways from the conference, they said that Tari and Steven Adams should be fully cleared well before training camp. Tari Eason's good enough that he can be playing 30 to 35 minutes per game next season. He couldn't this year because of his leg. It wasn't that he wasn't worthy of that. So you want to get more minutes for Amen and Cam. You want to get Tari into virtual starters minutes, I think, based on what I think his impact will be. And then you already made the move for Steven Adams. In a way, Steven Adams was an offseason acquisition. The Rockets just happened to do that deal early because they didn't want to waste Victor Oladipo's salary slot. And what before that was Kevin Porter Jr. And you wouldn't be able to trade a pending free agent, which Oladipo would have been if you waited until the summer. So from a salary math perspective, if the Rockets wanted Adams specifically and they wanted to use Oladipo as the vehicle, then that deal needed to be done in February. But based on him not being available until next season, it's basically like the Rockets already made one of their big offseason acquisitions, and that, defensive complement to Alperen Şengün at center, that's been a need that's been there all year. I mean, maybe it goes down a little bit with what Landale showed down the stretch of the year, but I think you can still do better, and that's what a healthy Steven Adams would represent. And he's still fairly young. I mean, I know it feels like he's been around a while, but what is his age? He's 30 or 31, I believe. I'm looking that up now. But the point is, yeah, just 30. He turns 31 this summer, and the Rockets will have bird rights, so they can keep him beyond this year if they want. Who knows? Maybe he ends up turning into a Nene-type center that ages well, gracefully into his mid-30s. But the reason I bring that up is that there's already a lot of guys who need to find either expanded minutes for, or new minutes for, in the case of certainly Adams, but Tari as well, in that he only played 20 games this season. So I would be very hesitant to bring in a marginal upgrade that is going to expect heavy minutes, or even moderate minutes, because the Rockets have higher priorities internally. One of the things that Rafael did below the radar that I think deserves a lot of credit, the guys he signed last offseason to smaller roles, think Aaron Holiday, Jock Landale, Jeff Green, none of them were so entrenched that they would, create a fuss, raise a ruckus, whatever you want to call it, if they got a DNP CD or only played 5 to 8 minutes in a given game. They're veterans who, by and large, were worthy of playing time, but if they had to take a back seat for some of the younger guys with more potential that were more developmental priorities, they were okay with that. So I think going into the offseason, saying that you don't have a clear need, and at this point, I don't think they do. It's not like there's someone you want to ditch from the rotation. It's not like there's some clear need. I mean, sure, there's little things you can do better. I think if you don't keep Aaron Holiday, you probably need another ball handler for insurance purposes. Ideally, you'd have a more above the rim, big type, maybe taking the Boban slot. I think maybe more movement shooting. You can always use that. But in terms of the rotation, it's pretty full as is. So I think going into the offseason with the mindset that you don't have to do anything, that's really useful because it tells me that they're not going to do anything out of desperation. When you do anything out of desperation, that's when you end up having a bad value deal, getting someone who may not be as, amenable to a smaller role. There's lots of things you can do when you go into lots of bad things you can do when you go into offseason thinking that you've got to fill a certain spot. And beyond just the basketball merits of anyone they sign or trade for, one thing that's really important to me going into this offseason, and this dynamic ties into it perfectly, I think the Rockets need to get more value contracts to help them with trades down the line. Because, Landale's the one guy that has a number of, basically 3 more years of 1-year options. Jeff Green and Jayshawn Tate, if they pick up the options, and I don't know that that's guaranteed, would be going into the final year of their existing deals. And then we talked about in some of our recent pods, Dylan Brooks is really the only filler salary that they have. So for me, I think it's less about you need to sign X, to use Rafael's term. It's not like there's a desperate need that you need to splurge or overpay for. So because of that, you can focus a lot more on value contracts, exactly what they did last offseason. They didn't get Brook Lopez, and they pivoted to Jock Landale, the guy who was willing to take a very friendly contract. When they didn't get their top of the line targeted acquisition in Lopez, they went to someone in Jock who was willing to take an extraordinarily team-friendly deal with all that optionality. Basically, every year of the deal, a human walking trade exception every single year. Even when Landale was terrible, it was still a good value for the Rockets. And now that he's shown some positive value in the second half of the year, it's clearly a positive deal. And so I would be stunned if there's no big trade this summer if the Rockets don't pick up that option. I mean, worst case, he's valuable insurance at center. And beyond that, he's going to be positive trade value as filler for them in hypothetical deals down the line, should they not strike the big deal this summer. So when you're not desperately going after one need or one position and thus artificially limiting your market, and also that may make you more desperate to, promise playing time, promise roles in a way that can disrupt your chemistry, then you're much more likely to, when you broaden your pool of potential free agents or trade candidates, whatever it may be, you're much more likely to get someone that's in alignment from a value perspective with financially, locker room dynamics, what you need. And I think for the Rockets, it's not just about the X's and O's of building a better team next year. I mean, sure, you want to help that, but you also want guys that, like Jock Landale, are on very friendly terms to help you with trade filler. And the last point I want to make on this, I think it's especially important if you do like Steven Adams, which after talking to people within the Rockets, I think they do. If you want to keep Steven Adams around and you truly believe in him, then that is the salary slot that, as mentioned before, was previously Oladipo and KPJ. So if you don't want to trade Steven Adams, then you need some salary to potentially fill what was that slot. And that's what you can do with some of your exceptions this summer or some of your trade opportunities. If you want to move one of your expiring guys for someone that might have a similar deal, but with an extra year on it, or maybe a extra year that's a team option, something along those lines. There's lots of possibilities. But the point is, I don't want the Rockets to just focus strictly on basketball, because when you don't have a clear need, it's not worth what you might have to give in terms of added money, unfriendly terms, promises of minutes. There can be a lot of downside. When you go into a summer feeling flexible, that's when you can really focus on value and take what makes the most sense. It's never, sexy to say, well, going into this offseason, the Rockets want to get tradable salary. But it is a goal. It is something that they need. And I think having this approach will make it easier to find that. Does that make sense to you, Paolo?
It does. And I think it's interesting that you said that. They could have done that this year. They didn't use the MLE, right? Couldn't they have done that?
Well, no, they were under the cap last year.
I know.
Because they signed Fred and Dylan.
But didn't they have it's not the MLE, it's the room exception.
Yeah. But that's small enough. Yeah, I see what you're saying, but that's a small enough salary that you're probably not going to get much bang for your buck with that. But
yeah, I meant if you could do like a Jock Landale type deal just with anybody out there. But I get what you mean. It's obviously that was just a thought that popped into my mind as you were asking me the question. I do see what you're going for. It's the tough part is I do agree with you that I think Jock Landale is going to get his next year of his contract guaranteed just because it's so flexible. It's why would you not unless you have another move that you want to do with the cap space, which the Rockets clearly aren't going to do as long as Fred Van Vlietstekker, then they're not going to have cap space, or it's not going to be worth it to have cap space because it would be too little. But it once again falls on that balance of it needs to be someone who, if they do go for it, right, if they do, create another human traded player exception, it needs to be someone whose reputation is so high around the league that even if they don't play, they'll still have some, some upside. It's not, it's either that, or you can do the reverse and go for someone who you still think has potential. That would probably be fine, just cashing in whatever years end up being taken from those options, that trade exception, right? Someone that comes to mind that people, because it's another center, but something that comes to mind, unless he has been extended already, that has been playing well for the team he's at, that is young enough, that hasn't made enough money, that they would probably settle for a contract like that, even if it meant getting no playing time unless something goes wrong, is Bol, who's currently on the Suns.
Interesting.
He brings rim protection, right? He brings length. He brings floor spacing.
He's a different type of big, even relative to both Sengun and Adams.
He's still somewhat young, and he hasn't had enough guaranteed money in his contract. Like, he's not young enough to be gambling on upside because he's 24. But at the same time, he hasn't made enough money. He's been a minimum guy for his entire career, which is for 4 years at this point, 5 years at this point. Let me just double check. Yeah, 5 years at this point. Whereas to the upside of just having guaranteed money, if it's MLE money, it's 10 to 11 million. Maybe those numbers are outdated, but that's what it usually is. For him, it would make sense to guarantee that type of money for a season and give up your flexibility on further seasons because he has made so little. And at the same time, as I said, he's not really gambling on upside anymore, even though he was for most of his career. So the playing time is not as important. So that's the type of guy that I would be looking at if that's what they want to move towards.
That's a good suggestion. And by the way, to your question about the room exception, one reason it could be different now is that for most of the last year, you've had either Kevin Porter Jr. or Victor Oladipo as potential salary filler. What I'm saying that may make it a little more important now, if you're more committed to Steven Adams actually being a part of your formula, maybe not just next season, maybe it's beyond. Maybe you think long term he's a perfect backup to Alperen Sengun in his 30s. He'll more gracefully accept, a 20 minutes per game type role. Maybe he'll be Houston's version of what Ime had in Boston with Al Horford, although I know those aren't an apples to apples comp. Obviously, Adams is nowhere near as developed on the perimeter as Al is. But if you do believe in Steven Adams being part of your blueprint, then that might make, getting a tradable salary a little more important now than it was when you had KPJ, and especially when you had Oladipo, who was clearly brought here just for trade purposes. So I think that's something that the Rockets, not being desperate and going after the type of player who would command a role, command money that might not be particularly friendly to the team. If you keep an open mind, if you aren't desperate, then you're much more likely with a broad pool and not feeling like you urgently have to do something, that's going to make it much more likely that you can find a guy who financially is in alignment with what you need for that value to be positive, not just to your basketball team, but also to your trade possibilities down the line as we talk about team building. By the way, one last asterisk I want to throw on this. All of this discussion is on the assumption that they stay the course and there's not a trade for a star. If hypothetically around the draft they were to trade for a star, then yeah, at that point, I think the calculus would flip in that, for starters, any star trade probably involves the Rockets doing a consolidation move where you trade 2 or 3 rotation players for one. And in that case, well, yeah, you need to use your exceptions much more aggressively for short-term upgrades because at that point there are rotation spots and rotation minutes that need urgently filled. And secondly, if you make an all-star level acquisition, then you're implicitly saying, okay, we're all in. It's about maximizing every last drop of the 2024 to 25 season, as opposed to if you stay the course. Again, you want to win, but you can be a little more balanced in that, sure, you aggressively pursue winning with everything that you have, but you want to keep the door open in terms of team building as well. All right, before we get to our last topic, Paolo, I think you had one more point you wanted to get in.
Yeah, I'm surprised you. So you remember in the beginning of the segment, I said I thought I had two of them, and I took one, and I thought you were going to take the other. I was
Oh,
just
what was
gonna
the
say,
other?
yeah, I was just gonna say real quick. I expected you to take his comments on extensions
Oh,
because I felt like he's obviously keeping neutral, but the
yeah,
fact that he's mentioning that hey, they have like the way the CBA works, we have it's not just this
yeah,
year, this is another year. I think signals what we've been saying on the pod or what I've
yeah,
been saying on Twitter, which is it's like I don't think it's likely that these guys get extensions this year unless they take pay cuts.
right.
And I
Relative to
thought,
the cap hold. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
when
just thought that was sort of baked in. Yeah,
yeah, 100%. But just I think Will at Bias Houston on Twitter had a poll this week where he asked fans whether they'd max extend Şengün right now, this offseason, and it was an 80-20 split, which tells me that an 80-20 split in anything in this fan base is an incredible result to have that many people agree. So it tells me that the majority of people expect him to get extended this offseason, and by the comments that Stone had, he
yeah.
might, but I don't think it's likely that it is at a max value, especially when he's mentioning, hey, like if we don't get it done this season, we can get it done the next season. I think that's people like he kind of cautioning people, like, hey,
Yeah, I
we
agree.
can do it right now, but we don't have to.
Yeah, social media lives in vibes. The business of the NBA is a lot more cutthroat, and there's no reason for the Rockets to give out a deal like that unless they get something back. I know a few months ago we talked about the possibility, and one reason to give a max deal is if you fear that he might be an All NBA player next year, and then it protects you against the super max. But the way Şengün finished the year and bringing in Steven Adams, who's going to cut his minutes, I think any scenario where Şengün is all NBA next year to take you into that bracket is very remote. Not saying you can't do it in time, but the idea that that happens next year, I think that's one of those, and if it somehow happens, then that's a really effing good problem to have, but it's probably not something you should plan around in 2024. So I think the Rockets will draw a much more firm line in negotiations saying, hey, we need something tangible in terms of you giving us something if we're going to give you this guarantee a year early. And by doing that, eat into our potential flexibility in 2025 relative to what they would have with the cap holes, which, if you turn down the option for Fred VanVleet or extended him at a lower number, could be, a considerable amount of space. All right, last topic I want to get to real quickly before we close out. We teased to it earlier. Reasons to watch the playoffs and what the potential exit of some of these teams could mean for the Rockets in the landscape of the Western Conference and the NBA. For me, it's pretty simple. I think in terms of Houston interest, besides the obvious of I think most of us would love to see James Harden get a ring, although that might actually run in contrast to the criteria I'm about to lay out, other than just little fan storylines like that, in terms of how it impacts the Rockets with them not playing. It's not nearly as impactful as last year where we were thinking about potential free agency storylines and the Rockets having a lot of space. I don't think it's going to be that aggressive. So I think what you're looking for is either, a situation where a team's disappointing exit could either potentially force a star level player to declare situation is crazy that maybe the Rockets would be interested themselves, or if not, maybe just that team taking a step back, at least if it's in the Western Conference, would be to the betterment of the Rockets as they try and move from 11th in the standings to getting higher up. So I was looking at the landscape amongst teams that are in the playoffs. And again, I'm focused primarily on the East, or I'm focused primarily on the West. So going quickly through the East, the only scenarios I think could be even remotely connected to the Rockets, and these are unlikely, but Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Philly. If Giannis, Mitchell, or Embiid goes out really sad, then I think there's, while unlikely, a chance in all of those scenarios, especially in the case of Mitchell, that they might ask out. And those are the types of players that the Rockets they're good enough that the Rockets, I think, would at least keep an eye on and inquire. Again, not saying I think any one of those is actually going to happen, but in terms of Eastern Conference, which is obviously a layer removed, those are the three that I just sort of have somewhat on my radar. Amongst the West, I would say the Pelicans with Zion and Ingram, the Clippers with their aging core, Harden, Kawhi, PG, the Lakers with LeBron and AD, the Suns with Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. It's a little different in those cases because with the veterans, no, I'm not saying the Rockets should go after, a 39-year-old LeBron James. No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying, or even like a 34-year-old Paul George, but what I'm saying is that if one of those teams goes out sad and let's say Paul George decides to go to Philadelphia, which has been rumored a few places, then the Clippers or Lakers taking a step back, and maybe LeBron just retires. He seems to leak that every year. Then a team like that taking a step back is to the betterment of the Rockets. So it's one of those things, again, it may not be as sexy as, oh, somebody becomes available that the Rockets could go after via trade or free agency. No, it's not like last summer, but still there could be some ripple effects. And so I'm looking especially at the older teams. Do any of them go out sad, especially those older teams that have underachieved a little bit already, like the Pelicans, Suns, and Lakers? Maybe you can throw the Clippers in there as well, given their baggage. That could potentially benefit the Rockets. And then the one team that already did go out in the West, which is Golden State. That is really, really useful. Number one, it's always fun to see the Warriors miss the playoffs, especially after the ridiculous fight they picked with Tari Eason. And then beyond that, with Clay about to become a free agent, I know they kept Draymond Green a year ago when folks questioned would they pay all the tax money to keep that team together. But that was 1 year removed from a championship. And they did win a playoff series last year and got knocked out by a Lakers team that you could argue, had 2 future Hall of Famers and one guy, Anthony Davis. That's a really big matchup problem for the Warriors without a big man. This year, with the Warriors being the 10 seed and going out sad in the 9-10 game, will they pay even more in the tax to keep this aging team together? I don't know. Again, in 2023, they did it, but they're less than a year removed from a championship. Will they do it in 2024 now that the writing seems on the wall? I don't know. And if they don't keep Clay, does Draymond try to team up with, LeBron in LA? I'm not saying it's for sure going to happen, but this is a year where at least I would think it's possible that the Warriors actually do change things up a bit. And if that's the case, with them being directly in front of the Rockets in the standings, that could have some impacts on Houston. Paolo, your final thoughts on the Warriors going out sad?
Oh, only happy thoughts about that one. I didn't actually watch the game, but I checked the box score the next day and I saw Klay Thompson didn't make a single shot, and I was like, damn. So it's like that. It's like you carried them, not carried them, but you were the difference maker between the earlier season Warriors teams and this close to the season, and this close to the season that kept the Rockets out of the play-in. But then you just went ahead and you just had the worst game ever in the play-in. Like, You take that many shots and you don't make a single one of them.
But in the context of the Rockets, do you buy that this could be a year that the Warriors actually do make more drastic changes and thus have a materially different outlook for next year?
I don't know how willing. So the Bob Myers is no longer there. I don't know how willing they are to let this core right into the sunset as much
exactly.
As, because,
I mean, I know Steph is Steph, but that's a lot of money. You're not that close to a championship anymore. To me, the more I think about it, this actually could be the year that there's some changes. And obviously, Chris Paul is aging out of the league as well.
On one side, I want them to do it because I just don't want to see. I have obviously pre-existing hate for this team, so I don't want to see them together anymore. I just want them to just go into tanking, right? I don't want to deal with this team anymore. They just have our number. At the same time, long term, if you're thinking long term, what I would do if I were their GM would be sell high or sell as high as you can. Probably should have done that the previous offseason, knowing the results now, but on the core and go into a rebuild. That's, to me, that's the correct decision. So I'm stuck between wanting them to fall apart quicker, which is the correct decision for them, and wanting them to be long term bad, which is what they will probably be if they stick with this core for a long time, unless some outlier thing happens, like Kuminga turns into an MVP type player. So I'm kind of stuck in between. But as far as what you said about playoff implications, I think most of the implications are, as you said, that teams falling apart because they didn't do well. The Warriors obviously are an obvious example. I think the Pelicans have bought themselves some time by making the playoffs this year, as long as they do indeed make the actual playoffs.
They may not with Zion out.
Yeah, I think the Lakers, even if it falls apart, they now have first round picks. Usually it's the Lakers. Oh, the Lakers are trying to get a star, but their package sucks. They actually have, I think, 3 tradable first round picks that they can make and protect, and that may net you a star in today's league. So I think the Lakers are going to stick around regardless of the result. I think the Suns don't really have any other options. I mean, it would be the Nets situation tenfold because they would be starting it earlier if they blew it up after this season, even if it's a first round exit for them. I think the Clippers are obviously the perfect example. If they go out in the first round, I'm not sure that you're able. I think that they're the one that is the flimsiest of these teams. And then the Mavs, I'm not sure how. Luka is a killer playoff performer, but I'm not sure how they can convince themselves, regardless of a 50-win season, which for them is good, can convince themselves that moving forward, a Kyrie Luka Doncic duo has championship potential if they go out in the first round this year. So
Fair
those
point.
are the teams I'm looking at.
With Dallas, I agree with you that if it doesn't work this year, it may not ever. But in terms of team building, I don't think they're at a point where any of the key pieces, like no matter what happens, even if they get swept in the first round somehow, I don't think Luka would ask out this year. You just gave Kyrie a new contract last year. So I think no matter what, they stay the course. And so the impact on the West standings is fairly net neutral based on their exit. I do think in the longer term, if we're talking 2-3 years, in the time period the Rockets are actually trying to ascend to contention level, then yeah, there's some validity to that. But just thinking in terms of this offseason and who's available or what changes might help the Rockets go up the standings, I don't see Dallas having a big impact there. To me, it's those other teams and the Warriors who already lost. And your point is well taken. If they stay the course, they just more gradually age out, it may be better for the Rockets in the long term. But if they break apart quickly, then it could be to the benefit of the Rockets next season, because obviously that's the team that was directly in front of them in the standings. All right, well, we'll put a bow on things right here. For Palo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. If you want more content before our next episode, best place to get it is on Twitter/X. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Palo is on there at Palo Alves NBA. And then the show, The Logger Line, is on there at The Logger Line, where if you hit the link tree in the bio, you can find obviously links to our partners, friends, and sponsors, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, but also our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify, those types of places. If you go there, subscribe, leave a positive review, you get the benefit of episodes right when they come out. Yes, we will be regularly updating throughout the upcoming offseason. We'll pick up draft coverage over the next couple of weeks as the Rockets get ready for the May 12th draft lottery. We'll see what happens with not only the Brooklyn pick, but small chance that perhaps they hold on to their own pick if somehow they end up in the top 4. Not a likely possibility, but somewhere between 5 and 10%, certainly not impossible, depending on what happens in the lottery. So we will have updates on that and many other subjects throughout the off season. And if you subscribe to the program and hopefully leave a positive review, then you'll get those episodes, those updates right when they come out. And with your positive review, we can keep looking good to those friends, partners, and sponsors as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we'll adjourn. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.